Hello and welcome to December the 17th and the next window in the TooFatLardies 2024 Christmas Advent Calendar. And the question behind this window is, what is it that draws you to your favourite wargaming period?
It's sometimes really hard to answer that question. Over the years and hundreds of war games, the scenarios and rule mechanisms sometimes seem to blur and be a little bit indistinct. Of course, I remember the good rules and the great games, and I definitely do remember the really good scenarios and the ways in which really good games get set up. But alongside that blurring of the memories, I do remember the historical periods pretty well, and I think that's because although my hobby is wargaming, I really think of myself as a historical wargamer first and foremost. History has been, for me, right at the heart of the hobby. There's a historical element to the games that I've played, and, at best, hopefully, the historical war games I've played have given me a better understanding of what might have happened in history. So when we're talking about favourite wargaming periods, I'd like to keep that thought in mind. Wargames periods don't just provide ammunition for great games. They might at their best help us unravel some of the mysteries and puzzles of history as well. So with all that being said, which is my favourite historical wargaming period? There's a lot to choose from, but I always keep coming back to the 17th century in Western Europe. It's a classic wargaming period. It's got combatants which are clearly identifiable. There's part of a classic feeling of warfare in that period. It's almost warm and cosy. The armies, French, British, Dutch, German, they've got almost homogeneous tactics and strategy. I sometimes think that it's almost a world of blue and red from those books that Charles Stewart Grant published. Those books of wargame scenarios in which one side's blue and one side's red. You can swap the forces around, but those scenarios work for almost any army in the period. It's a visual treat. The uniforms are wonderful and they're simple. There's not too much lace like the Napoleonics, but the coats and the reversed cuffs, really nice to paint, and there's not too much complexity. Foot, horse, dragoons and artillery. It's classic in the way that almost has a chess-like feel about some of the games which are being played. And we can almost stop there. The 17th century and the late 17th century in particular, with its vivid French, Dutch, English, Irish, German, Spanish characters, that's probably almost enough. We could say the Advent window's done and we just move on to the next one. But there's more. Because for me, a great wargaming period isn't just fantastic for recreating wargames on the table. It should really teach us a little bit about history as well. And like all the best historical miniatures, unpacking those bits of history which are really interesting can be quite complicated in the late 17th century, as in other periods. Because in the background of those almost two regimented lines of musketeers firing at each other and cavalry caracoling on the flanks, in the midst of all of that, that's the very tip of the iceberg of what's happening historically in a military revolution in Western Europe, a revolution in fortress building, and also a revolution in statecraft, diplomacy and economics. So the historical action on the tabletop is just the visible part of Western Europe coalescing into the forms of states that we have really right through to the present day. It's a key critical point for the British Isles as well. So from a British point of view, the 17th century gives us the British Civil Wars, the English Civil War and the Williamite Wars with Louis XIV. It's an impressive array of different battles, armies and campaign theatres to juggle with. Now on the wargames table, we sometimes glimpse the background of economics and politics and the emergence of nation states kind of dimly. They're the sort of things that really get thrown up in the accounts of the period. from which we then have to engage in tactical snippeting to try and find all the little bits and pieces of information relating to how armies fought, logistics and their organisation. But the 17th century, I think, is sometimes easier than later periods, and certainly easier than the Second World War, in being able to balance out some of those complex political, economic, geostrategic sort of threads than it is in, say, the Second World War or even the Napoleonic era. And that's because states haven't yet formed to become as all-encompassing as they are in later periods. You can still have kings and princes at the heads of their armies, and one battle can make a huge difference to the course of a nation. Take, for example, the Battle of Lutzen in 1632 and the death of Gustavus Adolphus. That was a key critical element in Sweden's development as, at that time, a major power. Individual things make a difference. People make a difference that can sometimes be more difficult to see in later periods like the Second World War. A nation's future can be determined by reference to defeat or victory at a battle like Poltava. Okay, that is in the 18th century, but fought with very much 17th century tactics, in a way that isn't really the case in a lot of the battles of the 20th century, where wars are decided by the economic power of the state and by national will. But with the 17th century, things happening on the tabletop really do make a difference in their historical terms, and that's why I always think of those games as representing the very apex, the fulcrum, or the tip of the iceberg relating to all of those other non-military things which are happening beneath the surface. I think that makes for a great game, and that allows you to weave in all those other considerations into what's happening on the tabletop. It just gives an extra dimension to all the beautiful flags and the well-painted miniatures and impressive German mid-17th century terrain on the tabletop. I also really like the fact that the 17th century is much more agnostic about boundaries and borders than later periods have turned out to be. Oh, hang on a minute. Sidney, that sounds great, but what do I mean by that? Well, I admit it's a bit of a hangover from the 15th and the 16th century. The 17th century is the great age of the soldier entrepreneur. People like Albrecht Wallenstein, who would be able to raise an army in a short period of time and later hire out those armies for use in different conflicts. I love that as a wargamer. I love being able to field two national armies but add historically appropriate formations in there. So Irish wild geese, or German mercenary foot, Livonian cavalry, or Italian infantry from Naples, or Croatian horsemen. And all of those can be featured in a 17th century army quite easily, without pushing the historical envelope out of shape. And if, like me, you're always interested in the what might have beens of history, there's lots of rich potential there for placing troops from one part of Europe into another part of Europe and explaining how on earth they were hired or got there. That's really one of my favourite bits in the 17th century. Kind of the elasticity of the different formations, different troops and different nationalities which you can represent on the Wargames table. So there it is, my favourite wargaming period. It looks magnificent. There's a good amount of the iceberg still underwater to try and discover. And also being able just to fudge things a little bit and make things up without really anyone being too bent out of shape with that. That for me really makes what I think will always be my favourite wargaming period.